Welcome to At the Coalface Live, everybody, for Friday, the 2nd of July. I'm super stoked to be with you again today, as I do every Friday at 4 p.m. New Zealand time, 2 p.m. Australian Standard Time. And we've got a lot to cover off today. It's been an exciting week in the e-commerce world. I've published my first At the Coalface Digest newsletter this week. We had a podcast episode with Jim Lofgren of Nosto drop this week. And then, of course, just general e-commerce news. There's been so much happening in the very dynamic e-commerce and digital commerce space. So there actually is quite a lot to cover off this week. It's a very exciting week. So I will get stuck straight in. First piece of news is a little bit of disappointing news, depending on how you see it. But online retailer Australia, which is one of the biggest e-commerce focused events that gets held every year. It's a big conference, and then it's followed up with the Online Retail Industry Award dinner, an awards presentation. It's always a big deal every year. I try to make it out to Sydney every year to attend. Online retailer wasn't obviously able to last year, and then they in fact I think for last year they went digital in 2019, and then this year I think they for the Aureas. Anyways, they did digital last year, and then they were going to restart physical this year, and it's been postponed with the new lockdowns announced for Sydney. So Online Retailer Conference and Expo this year was originally scheduled for 21 to 22 July, and it has been rescheduled to 29th and 30th of September. I'm still at the ICC, International Conference Center in Sydney, Darling Harbour, and the Aurea Awards, which are the Australia Post Online Retail Industry Awards. My God, that's a mouthful, which were originally scheduled for July the 22nd. Those have now been moved to September the 30th. So I know a lot of those guys over at Online Retailer, the conference organizers, and they always do a really good job. They always put on a good show, and it's always a bit of an epicenter for the e-commerce business and industry every year, and it allows those of us from New Zealand to go across to an easily accessible location for a really big e-commerce focused conference. So I'm bummed about it. I wasn't going to go across anyway for it, but I'm really bummed for those people that were organizing it and were planning to go on those dates, and now it's going to be delayed. But obviously, there's a lot of question marks around New South Wales reopening. They've gone into lockdown this week. So I guess they just want to give enough breathing room to hopefully let the COVID situation settle so that people can get into and out of the conference without any chance of it having to be canceled mid-conference. So bit of a bummer, but these things happen, and I guess the conference industry has gotten a heck of a lot better at adjusting to these types of situations. So don't envy the position that they're in, but they got to do what they got to do. Now, next piece of news this week is that Shopify Unite, which is their big dev conference, it used to be in person, but now it's effectively a webinar because of COVID. And I think they're actually looking at making this permanently a webinar-based event as opposed to a physical event. So this was held 2 days ago, so Wednesday the 30th New Zealand time, but it was started at like 5 a.m. So obviously didn't attend the live webinar, but I did watch part of the replay live, or watched part of the replay, and then also looked at all of the announcements that Shopify has made. Now I'll be doing a full and complete and granular breakdown of all of those announcements about the platform, its roadmap, new features and functions, and what that means for the industry, what that means for developers, what that means for agencies, and what that means for merchants. I'll be doing a full breakdown of that in the At the Coalface Digest for July, because it happened so late in the June month. But there were some pretty big announcements that I'll just cover off in brief today, because it did happen this week, and then I'll go into those later on in a lot more depth. But the first really big thing was that I believe that what Shopify did not talk about is really important. It's probably just as important, if not more so important, than what they actually did cover off. So there's two big announcements that I expected them to at least speak to, if not make any specific announcements around features and functionality in the pipeline around, but at least to sort of answer questions in the market around these two types of functionality. One is B2B. So we all know that Shopify doesn't pitch itself in the market as a B2B e-commerce platform. It doesn't pitch itself as being able to deal with those really complex B2B use cases, really complex product types in the B2B world. Being able to pay on account, being able to have different customer groups, different price lists, all those other things that are typically required in complex B2B and even in some cases D2C environments. Shopify doesn't pitch itself as being the right platform or the ideal platform for those environments without heavy customization. And yet with the growth of B2B e-commerce, particularly due to COVID, I was surprised to hear them not at least speak to B2B or make some commentary about B2B or what might even be in the pipeline around B2B functionality for Shopify. That was a big miss in my opinion in terms of what they could have telegraphed to the market about what their plans are for B2B and Shopify. The second piece of functionality they didn't mention anything about, which I definitely thought they would have in relation to all of these what they call Store 2.0 hydrogen and oxygen announcements. I was very surprised to hear them make no commentary about custom attribute-based faceting and filtering support in the platform. It's never had it natively. It's a constant sort of gripe and grumble from the marketplace, not only for B2B, but also, of course, for B2C brands as well. And very, very surprised to hear them say nothing about that, considering that they've done quite a substantial revamp to their theme architecture. They've done a substantial revamp to the way in which developers create their apps in a modular way, and the way that those get installed, and the way the assets get loaded, and all that sort of stuff. So I was very, very surprised to hear no mention of that either. However, there were still plenty of things to talk about, plenty of hype that went out to the market, and plenty of, I guess, talking points that will really, set the cat amongst the pigeons in the e-commerce platform space. The first is an announcement by Toby that Shopify will be introducing a zero rev share for app developers for apps that are accepted into the App Store for the first 1 million of annual sales of those apps through the App Store. Now, this is pretty big. I mean, when you look at Apple and the 30% that they take, and when you look at Android and the 30% that they take, and you look at these other app stores and BigCommerce's share and Salesforce Commerce Cloud and all these other major platforms in the marketplace, they all take fairly substantial shares from $1 onwards of your revenue that you generate through their ecosystem and through their app stores. Shopify's really thrown the gauntlet down in this regard, in my opinion, by effectively creating a $1 million USD threshold of annual sales through the App Store, and really, I think what they're doing is they're trying to cement their position as the premier platform targeted at developers, so that developers build their apps for Shopify first. They're really courting the development community. I mean, they've already got more apps than any other e-commerce platform on the market. They've already got really heavy developer buy-in, but this is really going to accelerate that, I believe. And I think it's potentially something that other platforms will adopt in some way, shape, or form to try to compete with Shopify and the vast developer ecosystem that they have built around their platform. However, what we have seen on the flip side of the coin is Shopify building out functionality within their own platform, or acquiring other technologies and functionality that they incorporate into their platform that ultimately makes certain apps and certain partners irrelevant within the Shopify ecosystem. So there is always that risk, and I guess that's always a risk with any platform, that they will go out and build something that you've written an app for that then now becomes native in the platform, and it deprecates your technology. So, really a massive upside there for developers, at least in the short to medium term. 1 million threshold, amazing effort by Shopify. I think this is going to just put the rocket underneath app development for their app store. So good on them. They made some really big announcements around Online Store 2.0 and what they're calling hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen being the front end framework that they're building out, and Oxygen being the hosting and underlying infrastructure framework for the front end that they're building out. And probably the biggest takeaway from this is that they never mentioned the term headless. However, it is clearly, when you read these announcements collectively, it's very clear that what they're building out is the ability to go headless without telling me you're going headless. So that's really where Shopify is headed, and they are looking at fully separating out their front-end theme engine and their front-end hosting environment from their back-end functionality, and completely separating those out so that developers can build completely custom headless front ends out on Shopify using Shopify Commerce functionality and using Shopify front-end functionality, but then being able to incorporate, for example, a headless CMS into the Shopify front end and fully integrate that without some weird and wonderful custom front-end integration. They're building a front-end framework, a front-end headless framework, and they're breaking out their monolithic front end from the back end so that they can capture a bigger share of the headless market. That's clearly what they're targeting. It's still very early days. It's still very nascent. It's still primarily a framework, but what they did mention is that they're creating, as part of the Hydrogen, which is that new front end, that new standalone front end is called Hydrogen, and then the infrastructure for hosting that's called Oxygen. That's what the names that they've given it, the code names. What they've said is that for the Hydrogen component, they're going to build out some starting templates or some starting elements and some starting componentry that will allow front-end developers to not have to start with a completely clean sheet of paper for front-end development. That will, the front-end templates that they'll be providing will surface some of the core commerce technology that Shopify has through the front-end template, so that not everything has to be built from scratch in Hydrogen. They'll give you some reusable components that developers will be able to leverage straight out of the gate. So very big announcement by Shopify, and I'll break this down further in the future. So huge changes to Shopify. Myself and Mike Angel from Carded really did, I guess, call this. I've been saying for some time, I think that's the direction that Shopify will ultimately go, to take on the headless market as it grows in demand and popularity, and to throw the gauntlet down to other platforms, like when we think of Magento, and we think of other platforms that have really been going hammer and tongs at the headless market. This is really Shopify's version of throwing the gauntlet down to those other players and competitors. So they've also introduced a new modular app framework, which is quite a big game changer. Now, what you may not understand, or what you may not know, is that Shopify and BigCommerce and other e-commerce platforms that have an app ecosystem or have an app model, an app-based model, because they're SaaS platforms, you can't access the back end of the platform. So if you want to effectively do front-end customizations, or if you want to do, some of that can be done through pure JavaScript on the front end. But if you want to do heavy customizing of the platform in terms of the front-end experience, you oftentimes will need an app to do that, whether it be a custom-made app or an off-the-shelf third-party app that plugs into those platforms, and it allows the platform to do things that it wouldn't otherwise be able to do out of the box. Now, typically the app vendor and the provider will have to host that app. They'll need to host the app. They'll need to host all of the assets that are stored in the app. They'll need to host all of the logic for the app. They'll need to host all of the theme components, which ultimately get injected into the Shopify liquid theme. And so there's a lot of, infrastructure, hosting, and logic and complexity in having to host all of that and then service it up through the app framework of Shopify. Now, one of the other downsides of that kind of more old school model is the fact that because all of the app's assets are not hosted by the core e-commerce platform, anything from that app that needs to be surfaced through the front end can slow the website down, because it actually has to reference data and it has to reference assets that are hosted on the app's server, which is independent of Shopify, and has to go and fetch that information, fetch that data, and then present it via the app to the front end experience, or at least to the back end if it's an admin only type of app that brings custom functionality to admin. So this new modular framework allows app vendors to host all of their app assets directly on the Shopify CDN. Now, this is quite a big announcement. It's quite a big game changer. As far as I'm aware, they're really the only platform out there that does it in this way. It's going to increase the speed and performance of apps running on Shopify, and it is probably going to dramatically reduce hosting and infrastructure costs for the app vendors themselves, because a lot of this stuff is actually going to be hosted by Shopify and served up by Shopify directly off of their CDN, off of their edge nodes that are located around the world in terms of their hosting infrastructure. So big changes coming to the modular app framework in Shopify and the way that they work with app vendors. And they're going to give some time, obviously, for app vendors to rewrite their apps to take advantage of all this new functionality. So it's a pretty exciting time if you're an app vendor for Shopify right now. One of the other big announcements, the final one I'll talk about today, is the Shopify Checkout APIs. Now, we knew this was coming. They've sort of pre-announced it previously. And they are further opening up their checkout APIs so that app developers and payment gateway providers can write their own integrations into the Shopify checkout. Now, previously, all of the gateways that worked with Shopify, those integrations were written and supported directly by Shopify themselves. And the app vendors, usually there was an arrangement where they would like help co-pay the development or fund that. So it's looking like Shopify is effectively going to allow the outsourcing of all the gateway integrations to Shopify, custom gateway integrations, regional gateway integrations, buy now, pay later integrations, etc. That those are all going to be now be able to be built out by the vendors themselves directly using the Shopify Checkout APIs. And this is also going to be leveraged by app providers and solution providers that do things like subscription-based or billing and all the rest. So basically, it's going to give an unprecedented level of access-controlled access to Shopify Checkout, and it is going to allow custom experiences to be built out by app and gateway providers. So big moves around the checkout, which has historically been completely locked down, and you could do very little with Shopify's checkout apart from change some colors in checkout. So big announcements there. Really exciting announcements. Again, I'll break these down over the coming month, and then also in the end of the month digest that I'll be putting out at the end of July as well. So super exciting times if you're in the Shopify world. Next big announcement is that Playboy Group has acquired Aussie lingerie brand Honey Burdette. Now, in and of itself, this is obviously exciting news for the Aussie business industry, the Aussie business space. You know, Aussie brands are really continuing to take it to the world and become very, very successful in their own right on the international stage. But this actually, sorry about that. That's my dog barking. It actually has a broader implications for the industry. Now, what Playboy has said is that one of the reasons why they've acquired Honey Burdette is because that Honey Burdette has better design capabilities, supply chain capabilities, sourcing capabilities, and direct-to-consumer capabilities than Playboy itself does. And Playboy wants to effectively acqui-hire both the skills and capability from Honey Burdette, but also adopt their go-to-market model and leverage some of their design skills, their supply chain capability, and their direct-to-consumer model as well. So Honey Burdette really built themselves on the back of social media marketing, influencer marketing, and the like. So it's also a brand that was founded by a woman. They build themselves as a brand by women for women, and it's a pretty exciting time if you're both in the Aussie sort of startup space, but also if you're a D2C brand that has found some success. You're probably gonna become an acquisition target for large international brands like Playboy that are trying to update their business model and their go-to-market model to adopt a more modern go-to-market model. Now, also, I believe that one of the reasons why Playboy acquired Honey Burdette is because they have an image problem. Their image problem is one of chauvinism, one of old school, exactly the same image problem that Victoria's Secret is facing, and why Victoria's Secret recently dropped their Victoria's Secret Angels program in favor of a more empowered woman program, ambassador program. And I think that, a halo brand like Honey Burdette, a women's empowerment focused brand like Honey Burdette, sitting underneath the Playboy brand gives it, it starts to show the world that Playboy is trying to take on a new way of engaging with the world. It is understanding the social and societal changes that are taking place, and therefore trying to adapt its business model to be relevant in a 2021 plus world. So lots of, I guess, meta concepts going into this acquisition. But really, from a D2C perspective, a direct to consumer perspective, Honey Burdette has over 60 physical stores globally, primarily in Australia. Plus, they have a very, very strong online presence, very strong digital play, very strong social presence, and really D2C brands that do this well can be very, very successful. And Honey Burdette was sold for USD $333 million, almost 443 million Australian dollars. So this was by no means a small purchase. And Eloise Monahan, the founder of Honey Burdette, obviously is going to do pretty bloody well out of this. So so good on them for taking it to the world and doing a really, really good job of it in the process. Now, this acquisition is actually very similar to the Adairs acquisition of Mocka back in 2019. So Adairs is a Australian-based homewares retailer, omni-channel retailer. They have physical stores and online, and they acquired Mocka, which is a pure play online homewares business based in Australia and New Zealand. And they acquired them for much of the same reasons that Playboy is saying that they acquired Honey Burdette. So they acquired them in 2019. And they acquired them because of their D2C capabilities and their digital capabilities and their database and their sourcing capability as well. So what's interesting about this acquisition is that Adairs recently made an announcement about, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, that they are paying $45 million to fast track their Mocka acquisition. And that is now going to take place. The finalization of that is going to take place this year instead of next year. So they're going to actually pay an additional fee to fast track that acquisition of that direct to consumer pure play Mocka brand and integrate that into their portfolio. And they say that they want to pour huge investments into that so that they can expand their penetration globally with the Mocka brand. So we're seeing this across the world. We're seeing very successful direct-to-consumer and pure-play direct-to-consumer brands being acquired by much, much bigger and older brands to acquire the talent, to acquire the skills, to acquire the customer database, and the go-to-market model that those brands bring to the table. So really exciting times if you're in the D2C space. The next really big announcement, which I was super excited to read late yesterday, was that the technology platform Shogun has raised $67.5 million in Series C funding. And that latest funding round values Shogun at $575 million. So, they're doing very well. Shogun, of course, creates and has a hosted page editor, page builder technology that plugs into the likes of Shopify and BigCommerce, and they've recently released their Shogun front-end technology, which is effectively a hosted headless technology, headless commerce technology. That's the full front-end environment and framework is fully hosted by Shogun, and they're really going hammer and tongs at the market over that. So, they're edging ever closer to that unicorn $1 billion valuation, and I wouldn't be surprised to see at some stage in the near future, instead of taking on more funding, I see probably an IPO in Shogun's future at some stage, or a full-blown acquisition by a much, much bigger player. So good on the guys over at Shogun. I recently interviewed Nick, one of the co-founders of Shogun, and that's going to come out on the At the Coalface podcast really soon. So keep your eye out for that episode because it is a goodie. Now, in some more COVID-related news, there's a report that just came out by B&T Australia that says that they did some research, and Aussie ad spending apparently now has soared and come back well beyond pre-COVID spending levels. So, and funnily enough, so what they said is that the total ad spend grew 78% off of the bottom of the COVID market last May. So basically, year over year, ad spend growth of 70.8%. That is a astounding level of growth in the ad market. So the market has come roaring back with a vengeance. And funnily enough, what they said is the fastest area of ad growth is out of home. So Out of home refers to billboards and kiosks for bus stops and basically anything that's physical outdoor. So signage that's outdoors, and digital signage and analog signage. So really interesting to hear that, and to read the hard data that shows that the ad spend has really not only recovered from the COVID lows, but also that there is increased competition in the ad space. Now, what this also tells us is that, and this reaffirms what Facebook mentioned about a month ago, which is that Facebook said that global ad growth on its platform, it grew about 50% over the last 12 months, and ad spend grew by over 30%. So ad costs grew by over 30%. So 30% annualized inflation rate of ad costs on the Facebook platform. So, we're seeing, because of COVID, we're seeing a lot more advertising being done because there's a lot more competition, particularly online. But this shows that there's also increased competition in the physical space. As lockdowns start to end around the world and people start to go back out into the world and they start to shop in physical spaces again, and as they start to drive around and drive to the office and use public transport and everything else again, we're seeing that the demand in those markets is high from consumers, and that's growing very rapidly as well. So spending is recovering, and so therefore ad spend is recovering alongside it. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens over, say, the next 6 months as rolling lockdowns stay in play in Australia, New Zealand, and around the world, how that's going to impact both physical spending appetite by the consumer, but also ad spend appetite, both digital and physical, moving forward. So it's going to be, we're going to have to really keep a close eye on this, and it really reinforces the fact that brands have to get smarter and savvier around their zero and first party customer data to help contain digital ad spend costs by refocusing on retention based marketing and customer lifetime value based marketing, as opposed to historically cheap acquisition-based marketing, particularly through digital channels. So if your brand today doesn't have a digital data play, particularly around your zero and first-party customer data through leveraging something like a CDP or a marketing automation platform or a CRM, it's probably time you started thinking about that, given the increase in ad spend across almost every medium on the planet. So that's the primary news that I wanted to cover off this week. And I'll just go back to, as I always do, I go back to the comments that have been made at the end of my spiel, and I try to bring those in. So awesome, Mark, to see you here. Thank you very much for making it. It's awesome to see you here. Lee, thanks for popping in as well. Good evening. Thank you very much. 4:30 p.m. here. So really good to see you join us today. Really appreciate that. And George, thank you so much. Really appreciate your understanding. He says, barking is allowed as long as it's informative. Well, I don't know about that. He's a small dog. He's only about 10 kilos, but I think he thinks he's about 100 kilos, and he tries to bark like he's about 100 kilos. So anyways, thank you very much for joining me today. And really looking forward to hanging out with you again next week. You can obviously follow all of my content on LinkedIn, on the podcast, and on at the Coalface Digest. So look forward to seeing you around the traps and catching up with you again next Friday. Thanks, team. Have a great rest of your day and a fantastic weekend.